Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with the one and only
Mhm.
Scott Utzinger. Before we go into all the success, we always like to start out with the basics, which was what was it like growing up? Were your parents tough on you? Did they tell you that you have to be successful, or did they want you to figure that out for yourself? And at what point did you realize I want success?
Great question. I would not say that my parents were tough on me. I had a great childhood in many respects, but certainly one of them was that I felt that my parents were incredibly good examples for me and showed me how to be a thoughtful, successful, happy person, but they didn't. My sister and I always say my parents never set rules for us, and when we would talk to them about that, they said, it's because we actually realized that whatever rules we would have set for you, you wouldn't have ever come close to, broaching them or breaching them, excuse me. And so they just didn't feel the need to set a lot of rules for us, right? And they didn't, say things like, you need to be successful or you need to get all A's or, that what they would do is they would listen very much to what I said, what my sister would say about what was important to us, what we liked to do, what we didn't like to do. They would then encourage us to, you know, pursue the things that we were passionate about, that we love to do. They would also, by the way, encourage us, and sometimes more than encourage in my case, uh, me to do things I didn't want to do in the interest of exploration and making sure that, it wasn't something that maybe I just had a preconceived notion about. For example, I did not want to take piano lessons, right? Were not interested, but they said you should take piano lessons and signed me up for them, and I took them until they let me quit, which was I think after about 2 years. And of course, as most kids who were in a situation like that would say as they're adults, oh, I wish they wouldn't have let me quit. I wish I would have stuck with it, things like that. But no, I mean, without digressing too far, the simple answer to your question is very few rules growing up. It encouraged me to focus on things I love to do, helped me find ways to be good at them, but never set sort of benchmarks that I had to set. Rather, they set examples for excellence and how to, but again, importantly, how to both be successful, but how to be happy in your success. And in terms of when I sort of first decided that I wanted to do something, so I grew up in a very small town in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. It was when I was growing up was 5,000 people, largest town for an hour in any direction, and most kids that I grew up with stayed in the area or stayed in the state. Once we graduated from high school, I think about half of my high school went on to college, half did not. A lot pursued the military or went to work, a lot of them on the family farms. But I knew I wanted to go to college, as my parents had done. And I was pretty sure I wanted to go away. I wanted to experience something different, see a different part of the world. And so my parents were super supportive of that. But backtracking, I think it was probably when I was about 8 years old that I uh, first decided that I wanted to be financially very successful. There were some television shows I liked to watch back then that, showed a lot of successful people. And I thought, you know what? That I would like to be like that. I want to live a life that has a lot of those elements. And so I set my mind to it back then to work hard enough to achieve those kinds of things.
Well,
So
I think it's pretty impressive that you were, like you said, 8 years old and you were thinking about that stuff. A
yeah,
lot of 8-year olds, they're usually, playing video games. They're not
yeah.
really thinking about financial success, which brings up my next question, which is, do you believe that you need a mentor to be successful? And did you have a mentor on your path to success?
It's a really interesting question. I think mentors can be very helpful. And I think if you had the choice of having one versus not having one, have one. If they're a good mentor, which I guess sort of goes along with the definition. Hopefully you wouldn't stay in a mentor-mentee relationship too long if it wasn't a good one. But I think they can be incredibly valuable. I do not necessarily think you need to have one to be successful. I can think of a lot of people in my life who could have, I could say, served the role as mentor. I've had many of those folks. I'm thinking, for example, of my first boss out of college. I had a few bosses there, but the one that I did the most work with, a partner at the little consulting firm I joined out of college, who I did a lot of work with, who I would consider to be not only a mentor, but a dear friend still to this day. He's in his 90s, but we're still dear friends. In fact, I have an email in my inbox. I need to respond to him today. He sent me pictures of the rhododendron blooming in his garden, and always likes a comment back when he sends me his garden pictures. So great friend, great mentor. But he was yes, he was in my first job out of school. But as I sort of think back on much of my career and much of my education, I wouldn't say that there was any one particular mentor who was sort of really drove my thinking or molded my path. Lots of people who were very influential, but I think different people are motivated in different ways and find guidance in different ways. I've always been someone who's extremely independent, like to find my own way, like to do my own work, like to come to my own conclusions. I like to, seek people's advice and input, but really like to come to my own conclusions. When I have a really challenging problem that comes my way, I am not the sort of person who picks up the phone or sends an email and calls a bunch of people for their advice. I actually just sort of sit down and think it through myself. And I might think it through for a long time, but I'm not someone who sort of relies on that external input, I guess, to sort of guide. And I don't think I really ever have been. I think if you were to ask my parents and my friends when I was younger, I was always quite independent in making my decisions. So that is not at all to say that mentors aren't valuable and can be really important in many people's lives and their achievement of success and happiness. In my particular case, I don't think it was so much that way.
It sounds like to me, though, that's what makes you a great investor.
Yeah.
Every time I look into the world of investing, I read about it. That's what everyone says is the best investors in the world. They're contrarians.
Right.
No, they don't follow the herd. They
Right.
think independently. And so that to me makes it seem like that is why you're a great investor. It's that simple.
You're kind to say it. Whether I'm a great investor or not will leave to other people to judge, but I certainly have had a long career in investing. That is hopefully not anywhere close to done. And I do think that my thought is very independent in investing. And I will absolutely echo what you just said in that I strongly believe the best investors are people who beat their own drummer. You can make good money following the crowd and investing for usually a short to medium period of time. But when the environment changes, as it inevitably does, when you follow the crowd, you also tend to lose a lot of money. And one of the cardinal rules in investing is don't lose money, right? To become a great investor, to have a great investing track record over time, I would argue it is much more important to minimize your losses than it is to maximize your gains, because the power of compounding is such that you can have, good upside as long as you have very controlled downside, you will have a good long-term track record. And in order to avoid big downside, in my opinion, it's helpful to think contrarian in a contrarian fashion. It can also be helpful to capture great upside to think in a contrarian fashion. Absolutely, no question about that. I know my own experience as an investor, and my success, to the degree there is success, is from the fact that I have been able to limit my downside. And that is true of the firm that I work in and the colleagues I work with. We are very much focused on not thinking much about consensus, but rather thinking about what we think makes sense in the world of investing, which often makes you feel very contrarian and frankly, very stupid for periods of time when you look very different than what the market has in vogue at the moment. So yeah, you have to have thick skin. You have to have a lot of people telling you either directly or indirectly that you're wrong, because to be a contrarian means that you will be wrong for a period of time before you are right. So yeah, it's funny. One of my first bosses in the investment management world used to say, when he was talking about recruiting for the investment analyst positions at the firm, he said, we don't look for the leader of the Boy Scout troop, the Eagle Scout, or the class president. We look, because those people have not that they don't have amazing skills, but they tend not to be the skills that lead to long-term investment success. Becoming class president means you won a popularity contest, right? That's usually not the sort of person who is going to be comfortable being highly differentiated in their thinking, right? So I've often said that in the investment world, we tend to be a bunch of nerds and misfits, right? Who are comfortable with that status. By the way, I was class president, although I was never in the Boy Scouts. So I don't know what that says about my ability to be a great long-term investor, but I think the point is, with every rule, there are always exceptions. So you have to recognize that very few. You will learn over the course of our time together, Enrico, that I do not think in black and white. I tend to think in shades of gray. I don't think the world is black and white. I think there are very, very few issues that are black and white, as much as we would love them to be, because it's easier to think that way. But as with most things, I think in the case of, what makes a great investor, there's a mix of attributes, and having a bunch of them, though very few people are going to have all of them, right, going to make you successful. So
let's go back to the 8-year-old you for just a sec.
You
knew
Does that mean I get my hair back and get rid of the gray? So yeah.
So you knew you wanted to be successful financially. Is that when you knew that you had to go into finance, or
No,
a couple more years to
definitely.
go into that world?
Definitely. So at 8 years old, I made the flip of the switch in my head. Until I was 8, I wanted to be a dentist like my dad. I think when I was probably 3 or 4, I wanted to be a fireman, as most little boys do. But once I sort of got over the fireman stage, I was pretty sure I wanted to be a dentist like my dad was. But when I turned 8 and I got hooked on a couple of these television shows that were about business people, right, not dentists. Not a whole lot of shows out there about dentists. But that's when I decided I wanted to be a business person. But the couple of shows that I'm particularly, sort of thinking back to in my head that were very influential for me, were about people who were what I would call just sort of running big companies, right? Not financial people, not investors, but just running big conglomerates and that sort of thing. And that was what I thought I wanted to be. And frankly, that persisted through high school, through college. I did my my college work in management, not in finance. Of course, I was in an undergraduate business school and also engineering. So I took both engineering and business courses, but within business, I focused on management as opposed to finance, because I thought I wanted to be in general management. And it wasn't until I went out and worked in the world of consulting for 4 years and really enjoyed my time consulting. But it was as I was starting to think about what the next step was after being a junior consultant, okay, how do you become a successful consultant? How do you make partner in a consulting firm? Well, you become a rainmaker, right? You have to bring in business. That's how you become a partner in most consulting firms. That is not something I've ever liked to do, and I don't think I'm frankly all that good at it. But I've always liked investing. I bought my first stock when I was 11 years old, and I always did that as a passion, right, and a hobby, even while I was in business school and while I was in working in management consulting. But I never really thought about investing as a career until I went back to business school. And when I went to get my MBA and I started meeting a bunch of other people who worked professionally in finance and in investing, that's when the light switch turned for me to think, okay, this is at least something I want to try. So that's when I took an internship in the investment management industry between my first and second year of business school, and I was absolutely hooked. I absolutely loved it. So we can talk more about that, but I want to try not to ramble too much and stay fairly focused on the question you asked.
No, it's perfect because you started going into the education, which was where I was going to point you next, which was you're very, very educated. And so what does education mean to you?
Yeah. So for me, education, well, and actually I would say my perspective on education has evolved so much from the time that I was in my, formal education period. I enjoyed all my education. I enjoyed, elementary and high school. I enjoyed college a lot. I loved business school. And so I have very favorable views toward those things. But I think now that I'm much older, now that I've served on the board of a charter school in Boston for the past decade and been involved with that school for, 16, 17 years. And now that I have my own children, the first of which is going to start school in August, I think much differently about education than I did when I was being educated, formally educated. I think we're all being educated, our whole lives, hopefully. But my formal education, what did that mean to me? Because I think that's primarily what you're focused on here. College for me meant, as it does for so many kids, just a complete change of lifestyle. I moved from the aforementioned 5,000 person town in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, a dairy farming community, which was great. Loved growing up there. But I moved from there to West Philadelphia to go to the University of Pennsylvania and be in a extremely competitive program called the Management and Technology program, where I was doing a business and an engineering degree simultaneously. So I worked harder than I've ever worked in my life. More importantly, that I've always worked hard. I always like to say I know I'm a reasonably smart person, but the reason I've had the academic and probably the business success I've had is because I've historically been willing to work a lot harder than most people I know and put in more time. Certainly in school, that was the case. Because I assure you, I went to school with a lot of people who had a lot more natural horsepower than I did, but I just worked my butt off so that I could try to, equal them and in some cases maybe even one up them in a few grades. But so for me it was the hardest I'd ever worked, but most importantly it was the first time in my life where I felt I was surrounded by people who had much richer educational backgrounds than I did, which is not to knock the public high school and elementary school education I had in small town Wisconsin, but it was nothing like what most of my classmates who came from the Northeast and particularly from New York brought with them. I will give you a very specific example. First week of school at Penn, a bunch of us were sitting around talking in the dorm about what our class schedules looked like, and people were mentioning all this AP credit they had, and they kept throwing around the term, AP credit, and I'm actually, people would say things like, I'm actually taking sophomore level classes now because I passed out out of all the freshman classes, and I literally looked at them with blank stares because I'd never heard of AP, didn't even know what it was, and they were astonished, right? So that just gives you a little perspective about what they came to the table with versus what I came to the table with. And I took me a semester of of not doing as well in school as I would have liked to. I still did fine, but by my standards, I really never had a B in my life, and I started getting some Bs, and I didn't like it. I just said, okay, they come with a lot more preparation. But what have I always done when that's been the case for me? I've just buckled down and worked harder. So I started a regimen where, I would come back from classes, I would do an early dinner with whoever was around in the dorm who wanted to have an early dinner. And I headed to the library, and I didn't leave the library, my carrel in the, fourth floor of Van Pelt Library on Penn's campus, usually until midnight or 1 when I was done doing, all my work. And I didn't sit around and watch television. I didn't go out partying, and I didn't, what a lot of my other friends were doing. And it became a running joke with all my friends. Like it was like my dorm room was the carrel at Van Pelt Library. But that's what I knew always worked for me, was working hard. And that's what I decided I needed to do to do well and do as well as I wanted to do. And again, this was not pressure from my parents. This was pressure from Scott saying, I don't like these. That's not what I'm capable of more, and I know I can. And so I just did that. I just worked really, really hard. And I did that for three years, because my first semester I worked hard, but I was trying to be social like everyone else. And so I wasn't working as hard as I ended up working for the subsequent 3 years. And then I will say, for my second semester of my senior year, I had front loaded enough classes that I could actually kick back and really have a lot of fun. And I knew where I was going to work, because I had already accepted my job at that point. And so that second semester of senior year, I actually said, okay, Scott, give yourself a little break, have some fun. I still worked hard, still did well in my classes, but it was a downshift for me. And that was quite that was a fun time for me, and a little bit of a sort of self-congratulatory, hey, you worked really hard, give yourself a little bit of a break. So education, that undergraduate education for me, was just a huge cultural shift, a huge shift to this mindset of, oh, wait a minute, I'm no longer big fish in small pond. I am very, very small fish in very big, very experienced, very impressive pond. That was a whole new feeling for me. And it forced me to change my mindset, right, about how I was going to get through college. Then I worked for 4 years, as I mentioned, and decided to go back to business school. Wasn't certain that I would go back to business school all along, because I had a very good undergraduate business education from the Wharton School. But I knew as I was working in consulting, I knew that context was going to completely change what I got out of the classwork. So even though I knew there were going to be classes that had the exact same title, and in fact, a few where we used the exact same textbook I had used as an undergrad 4 years later in business school, the learning that I got out of it the second time around was so much deeper and richer, because of the context that I then had, having worked for 4 years, to apply to that academic learning. And so, plus, honestly, an MBA in many cases is also an opportunity to just go hyper networking, right? To meet so many people who've done so many different things and really figure out, hear and learn from your peers, in part academically, but also vocationally learn about other roles and other things that you haven't experienced. And so for me, that was a big part of my MBA, was just trying to be a sponge and learn from my classmates about other roles, other industries that they'd worked in. And that's where I made the switch to go into finance, and very happy I did. I did love consulting, but I think it's fair to say that how can I say this the right way? I'm glad I went into consulting, glad I went into finance from consulting, even though I think I probably could have had a reasonably successful career in consulting. I think I'm happier having gone into finance, which tends to be a much more independent type of work. And I think that suits my personality better, probably, than consulting would have long-term, especially, as I said before, given the fact that, I could work for years and get to a pretty senior level in the investment world without really having to be the guy bringing in business, but that would not have been the case in the consulting world. So I've rambled again. Hopefully hopefully addressed most of what you were looking to get out of that question.
Definitely. Like you're so disciplined. Did that come natural for you or did you have to train that? It just amazes me how disciplined you are as an individual.
Um, I would say that was a skill that came through the gene pool. I I have always been extremely disciplined. Pretty strong willpower, pretty self-directed. That that's something that I think I got from my parents, mostly genetically, but also because my parents were that way, very, very disciplined, self-controlled people, focused, but disciplined. I think that's a good word for it. It's not usually a word that I think of when I think about myself and my skill set, but I think it is actually a fair characterization. I think discipline is a good way of describing it. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your time at Fidelity
Mm,
and move over to Wellington, which I know was a major, major part of your life because till this
yeah.
day, I have friends from there that you still chat with. So
Yeah. Sure. So, and I might take it in reverse since I went from business school straight to Wellington and spent a decade there. And then I spent a couple of years at Fidelity before joining my current partners in an entrepreneurial fund. But those were two great experiences, quite different despite being big, highly regarded companies in the same industry. And my job the job description looked very similar. And in fact, what I did day in and day out was very similar at Wellington and Fidelity, but culturally, they're fairly different organizations, and particularly the research analyst role that I was in at both organizations is different between the two places. And so yeah, I'll let me give you a few specifics. First of all, I'll say I look back on those 12 years between the two organizations as incredibly valuable, taught me how to be an investor. Yes, I had, purchased stocks on my own, again, as I said earlier, as a hobby and as a passion, but I didn't know how to be a research analyst, right, or an investor until I got into my job at Wellington and really, and what's interesting about Wellington, so I said I didn't know how to be an investor. There really isn't formal training for the job of a research analyst or portfolio manager. It's all on the job, right? It's all about, did you come with a passion for investing? Doesn't mean you have to have done a lot of investing, but did you arrive? Do you show up each morning with a really keen interest in the markets and in stocks and in companies and trying to figure out what makes them tick and what might make them successful or not successful? You have to be passionate about that to be a good analyst and investor. If you don't have that passion, I don't think the best job and the best investment organization is going to get you there over time. I really honestly believe you have to come with that passion, which doesn't mean to say you have to come being a great investor. You just have to come being passionate about investing and research. So luckily I had that. And then I showed up at Wellington first as a summer intern and then as a full-time global industry analyst for the following decade, and just watched what my peers did in the organization and just, did what came naturally to me, but then kept tweaking it as I would see how others who had been doing it a lot longer and far more successfully did it. And, it's definitely a job where you learn from, I'm going to say you learn from your mistakes. And I do believe there's truth in that. I heard someone a long time ago, and I wish I could remember who it was, say, you don't actually learn from your mistakes. You learn from your successes. You build character from your mistakes. And I actually think there's a lot of truth in that. You certainly remember your mistakes and you learn what not to do, but it maybe doesn't teach you exactly what to do, right? Because the opposite of what you did is not always obvious, right? It's in the world of investing where it's not as again, you're going to hear this theme from me a lot today. It's not black and white. It's not yes and no. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? Well, maybe you did A and that didn't work out well. Well, does that mean B is the right answer? No, it doesn't. So you don't necessarily learn the right answer from your mistakes, but it definitely builds character, and it teaches you how to handle mistakes and failures. But I think you actually do learn more from your successes and what you got right than you do from your mistakes. Maybe it's a semantics argument. It probably is, frankly. But at least in the world of investing, I would say that I've learned more from the things I got right than the things I got wrong. But you get a lot of things wrong, right? In the world of investing, if you're batting 55, 55, 45, you're happy, because that will lead to long-term success. No one bats 90 or 100% in investing. It just doesn't work that way, at least not in public equity investing, maybe in private equity, maybe. But even then, I would be skeptical. But in public equity, stock market investing, you're going to have a lot of losers, and hopefully you will learn things from them. But it will definitely build character. So I loved those experiences, learned so much, enjoyed covering a whole host of different industries, starting off covering travel and leisure, or well, actually back even further as a summer intern covering the supermarket industry at Wellington, and then transitioning to covering the travel and leisure space at Wellington. And then after a few years doing that, picking up the media space. And I'd actually been a media consultant before business school, so it was sort of a natural fit for me to go in to use some of that industry-specific knowledge to ultimately cover media at Wellington, which is then when I transitioned from Wellington to Fidelity. I also covered media and internet, because internet was becoming such an integral part of the media world at that point. So great experiences covering a lot of industries, learning from people far, far more experienced and smarter and more successful than I was. That is how you learn, in my opinion, to be a great investor, is you bring that passion and then you just watch people who do it well, and you try to figure out what elements of their approach and their style will work for you, because your own personality is incredibly important in what type of investing you end up doing. There are people whose personalities lend themselves much better to growth and momentum investing. There are people whose personalities lend themselves much better to value and contrarian investing, or small cap or large cap. And of course, then you can layer on, specific industries or specific geographies, and your personal experience and your personality, I think, can lend itself to different industries in more or less with better or worse fits, I guess I'll say. So great experiences, very different organizations in the sense of what the research role is. And the key element of difference there is that in both organizations have been very successful with their models. So you can't say one is right or one is wrong. But when you grow up in the first 10 years of your experience are in one model, you tend to be biased, as I was, thinking that was the way I would succeed best, is in the model where the research analysts managed a fair bit of money themselves in the style of the sectors, or I shouldn't say in the style, but in the sectors that they covered, they ran a bunch of money. And I personally always felt that it was one thing to be a good analyst and tell portfolio managers what to invest in. It was quite another to actually manage the money yourself and be forced to make the investment decisions, because it's very easy to tell someone to buy something, and frankly, where the rubber really meets the road is when you've told them to buy it and then something happens and the stock goes down 20%. What do? Do you stick with it because as a research analyst you have a buy on it and you don't want to look like an idiot and you don't want to admit that you got something wrong? So the question is, do you stick with it, right, and say, well, the market's getting this wrong and it's still as valuable as I thought it was and you should stay in it? Or do you say, no, something changed, fundamentally changed, and you got to sell? I know the stock's down 20% and it's painful to sell, but this stock isn't going to work for a while and we should be out of it. I'm not saying there's one right or wrong answer there. The market will tell you what the right or wrong answer is. Sometimes it's that you should double down and sometimes it's that you should get out. What I'm saying is that when you are not just the analyst with buy and sell recommendations, but when you are the analyst plus you are a portfolio manager running your own money in those stocks, it really is far more telling about the conviction you have in your buys and sells, because you can look at what you're doing in your own portfolio, and portfolio managers can look at what you're doing in your own research portfolio and say, Well, he says the stock's still a buy, but he just sold half his position. I think he doesn't have the confidence that he thinks he has, right? So I have always felt that that model of research, senior research analysts managing money is very powerful. And that's how I did it at Wellington. The Fidelity model tends to be, and there are exceptions within Fidelity, but the Fidelity model tends to be, let's have our research analysts be research analysts, cover a bunch of different industries with the goal of then graduating to become portfolio managers. Very different at Wellington. The portfolio managers usually come, senior portfolio managers come externally, and research analysts grow, mature to become senior research analysts, but still research analysts, just managing a bunch of research sector money. So they're two different models. Both have been very successful. Can't say one's right or one's wrong. I just know the one that I spent the majority of time is the one that I always felt more comfortable in. So for me, after 10 years, or I guess 11 with my internship at Wellington and that model that I'm talking about, and then moving to Fidelity where it wasn't that same model, I sort of fairly quickly realized that I wanted that model back again. And that's why I ended up making the decision to leave Fidelity and join a couple of friends who had started a hedge fund, a very small hedge fund a few years earlier. They had actually asked me to join them at the time they were starting it. And I'll stop in a second. They'd asked me to join at the time they were starting it, and I wasn't ready. I was still very much in a mindset of being in the bigger organizations with more resources. But a few years later, I was ready.